It's The World This Week. 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast, foreign editor of The Daily Beast. Christopher Dickey is with us. How are you, sir?
Good. Glad to be here.
Glad to see you. Glad to see Vivian Walt, Paris correspondent for Time magazine.
Good evening.
How are things?
Great.
Great. Okay. Yeah, France 24's Yenna Lee is with us as well. How are you?
Great.
Great as well. Gosh, and Pierre Haski, a news columnist.
I can only be great.
Or the greatest. With France Inter, the flagship French public radio station. President as well of Reporters Without Borders. The World This Week on Facebook and on Twitter. The hashtag is World This Week. It's what you might call hardly reassuring. Iran's deputy health minister dismissing talk of a cover-up in the true numbers of cases of coronavirus as he is seen coughing and sweating at a Monday press conference. The next day, he's in hospital being treated, which is no laughing matter. But it's Christopher Dickey. We were talking earlier about you have to, faced with an unknown outbreak like this one, authorities have to maintain credibility. And for Iran, this is a major test.
I think Iran didn't have very much credibility to begin with because there's a huge discrepancy between the number of infections that they're claiming and the number of people who have died. It's much higher than anywhere else. What that tells you most likely is that they are undercounting the number of infections hugely.
Or don't have the means to properly monitor.
Well, they say that, but I think they just don't want to know. The whole approach has been to say it's really no big deal. We think quarantines are something from the Stone Age. They date from before World War I. We're not going to do that. That's exactly what the deputy health minister was saying while he was wiping all the sweat off of his face. And, then he comes down with the coronavirus. And apparently it was spread around through the ruling party. The vice president for women, Masumeh Abtekar, she's now got the coronavirus. She's got COVID-19. So it's going around. Clearly, lots of people have it. Clearly, they are undercounting. And the Iranians travel, as we know, very, very extensively in the region. And people go to Iranian shrines very extensively. And the epicenter in Iran is what? The biggest, most important religious city in Iran, maybe after Mashhad, but Qom. So this is a disastrous situation for the region and for the world, and they're making things much more dangerous for everybody.
Much more dangerous for everybody. And as we've seen the numbers stabilize, Vivian Walt, inside of China, we've had, Mecca, which is shut to pilgrims. And as Christopher was saying, the whole Middle East on edge, Europe on edge, the first cases elsewhere.
Yeah, just think about the extension of what Chris was saying. You have the epicenter in Iran being Qom, the big religious center. There's an enormous close relationship with the religious centers in Iraq. So, it doesn't take much of an imagination to imagine this spreading very quickly across the borders, as it has in Asia, across China's borders. And I think one of the most unsettling factors about this whole thing is that there's really no visibility on how big it might get. And there, at the moment, outside of China, there's no sign that this is tailing off. It's only inside China, if one can believe the statistics, that the numbers have dropped so sharply.
If you can believe the statistics. Yenna Lee, let me ask you about this, because 3,000, there's been in South Korea, a huge amount of testing that's been done. Thus, the numbers are very high there in terms of people who've tested positive. How jittery, how edgy are people there? Do they feel as though there is transparency, that the numbers are credible?
Well, I think South Korea's gone with a different approach than Iran and China because it is a very, fully-fledged democracy. It's gone with complete transparency. There's mobile phone alerts. Every time you walk into a neighborhood where somebody who has contracted COVID-19 has been, you'll get an alert on your phone. There are multiple mobile phone apps you can download where you can find out if 100 meters next to you, there's a restaurant where someone who had COVID-19 walked through. There's so much information available. It's quite amazing. It's very high tech. It's very transparent. It's almost so transparent, though, that I would say it's a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, it's great to be informed and great to know everything that's happening. On the other hand, it's very panic-inducing for a lot of my friends back at home and my family. You get these alerts constantly saying that this virus is everywhere around you. So, double-edged sword. Because it is.
Because it is, Pieraski, and it is more potent than the flu, but it's not as potent, from what it seems, than other major pandemics.
The thing is that epidemiologists for years have been convinced that one day we would have the equivalent of the Spanish flu that killed tens of millions of people more than 100 years ago. And that is their obsession when a new virus appears on the scene. They want to make sure that it's not the big one. And so as long as they don't know everything about it, the transmission, the mortality rates, the side effects, and so on, they will take the utmost precautions, because they're afraid of the thing that will take over the world. And so we are still in that phase where the WHO tells the whole world to keep ready to contain it and to stop it as much as is possible. At the beginning, they thought they would contain it in China. China took late after covering up, but after a while, they took very, very important decisions of containment of 5 times the population of France. But they didn't manage to contain it within China's borders. So today, I think there's not a single continent that's free
Spared
of coronavirus, even if Africa is reporting only, sub-Saharan Africa is reporting only 1 case in Nigeria, but I think maybe with some delay, but it will.
Nobody believes that.
The gavel, in any case, can't come down soon enough on this week's trading on Wall Street. The New York Stock Exchange, with its biggest 5-day losses since 2008 and the financial crisis, wiping $3.4 trillion in value from the market. We've also seen oil prices tank to somewhere like $45 a barrel right now, Christopher Dickey. And again, it's this idea that we have these chains of supplies in this globalized world we live in, where if a factory in China shuts, the automobile plants in Western Europe close down.
If China has COVID-19 and the world gets a fever, yeah, sure. But I think that this will level out fairly quickly. Not that the disease will level out very quickly. There's a pretty reliable epidemiologist at Harvard who thinks that somewhere between 40 and 70% of the global population will have some experience of this disease over the next year, which is phenomenal. And a lot of people will die, but a lot of people won't. And the reason it is moving so quickly is because so many people travel around who are completely asymptomatic or who have very light cases. And the prediction is that we will wind up having, instead of the cold and flu season, eventually we'll have the cold and flu and COVID season. And it will just become part of life. Like with all things financial, as that gets factored into the system, I think you'll start to see a rise again in the markets and a general calming of the situation. It's not a happy thought, but it's not the idea that it's the Spanish flu. It's certainly not the bubonic plague. It's not Ebola. And the reason that it keeps traveling around so fast is because it's none of those things. Those tend to be self-limiting. People die so fast they can't spread them. But this, they move around without dying and without even exhibiting serious symptoms.
But it seems like the 2 problems with this virus, and that is, firstly, there's such a long period before the symptoms really present themselves. So you can be moving around all over the place.
If they present themselves.
If they do. And the second is that the death rate is so much higher. I mean, it's vastly times higher than
Than the
regular flu, which obviously kills thousands of people every year. But if you look at the percentage of people infected to the percentage of people who
So we had
die,
doctors on last night's show said it's 10 times more.
10 times more. There you
But-
go.
but-
At
yeah.
least, yeah.
But seasonal flu kills 1 in 1,000. So it's
Well, plus there's a vaccination for it. So, you know, it's...
But the point you were making about the supply chains and the disruption of globalization, of economic globalization, is something that is in everybody's mind today, because our dependency on these complicated supply chains has
we heard the
proved,
French- we heard the
has
French-
proved very vulnerable.
we heard the French finance minister this week
Yes.
saying
a
we
game
rely too much on China, not just for automobile parts, but for things like medicine.
But you see, I was listening to an interview with the head of the Pharmacy Academy in France. Not sure whether exactly it is, but dealing at least with the medical fabrication. And he was recognizing that the reason for so much building of factories in China or India rather than Europe was because of environment preoccupations, because the standards became so high here and so low in India and China that it was. It's not only because costs are cheaper; it's also for those reasons, which are very bad reasons. It's better to pollute in China and India rather than here, and so that aspect, that dimension of globalization, should really be reconsidered. I mean, there's so much about social inequality or environment that has been totally dismissed over the past 30 years, that I think this type of crisis should be, maybe it will not
opportunity.
be, an opportunity to rethink things.
All right, at the epicenter in Italy, the Lombardy town of Codogno, resembling a ghost town with residents stockpiling goods, and some on social media wondering aloud, well, if we're not all going a bit overboard with all of this.
Ma perché ci sono gli scaffali della pasta vuoti? Ma che cosa sta succedendo? Manco quando è scoppiata la seconda guerra mondiale c'era stato un panico così.
He's angry about missing on his pasta. We see the stockpiling of toilet paper in Japan. You were talking earlier about everyone being on edge in South Korea, but there is, at what point does it, how should I say, switch to the irrational, Yana Lee?
Well, I have been talking to a lot of people in Seoul right now, and they've been complaining a bit about the rise in prices of masks. Some people are trying to keep it clean, trying to keep the prices as they should be, but then the stocks run out, so then you have to sign up and wait for the next batch to be delivered. There is a little bit of panic because all the authorities are saying all you can do is wash your hands and wear a mask. And then there aren't enough masks, so that does create a bit of panic. At the same time, people seem to be somewhat getting used to the idea of living under not real quarantine, it's self-quarantine. People are just being more precautious. They're not going out as much. Movie theaters are empty. Schools, la rentrée, going back to school has been pushed back after the winter holidays.
In Japan, they're going to have school off for a month.
Good for them. I saw a really interesting article about how Korean kids who are used to so much pressure, they're taking the time off to actually spend time with their siblings and their parents, people they don't actually get to spend time with because they're so busy studying. So.
I think we can anticipate a population explosion in a few months.
Also,
Perhaps.
happen.
Chris Ruzicki, then there's the argument over, at this point in time, as you said earlier, that if this is going to become something that's factored in, then what do you do? Do you work on a vaccine or do you work on treatment? That argument going on inside the French medical community. And over in the U.S. of how do you make treatment available and affordable?
Well, that was the great line from Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, when she was saying, we have to have treatment that is affordable, not that's free, not that everybody can have. It's so American that you wouldn't get free treatment for an epidemic like this. But obviously the answer, or the partial answer, is to develop a vaccine. But we're talking, most people say, between 12 and 18 months, optimistically, to have one that's proven effective and goes through human trials. So that's quite a while. That means that even if this is a seasonal disease, which a lot of people are hoping, that the summer will somehow tone it down as you have with the flu, we'll be into the next season before there's any vaccine. So all of that is very problematic. But at the end of the day, as it becomes normalized, the vaccine will become part of it. But let's hope the vaccine is more effective than the flu vaccine, which is only effective in about 50% of cases, roughly, and about half the people who should take it in the United States never do.
Let me turn to the former Beijing correspondent here a second, Pierre Aski. Writing in the New York Times, tech journalist Li Yuan lists instances of the backlash against the official propaganda that's been openly aired on social media, including a blog post entitled "News Coverage Should Stop Turning a Funeral into a Wedding."
It's been a remarkable situation because everybody thought that the party and Xi Jinping had won the game on the internet, that the censorship, the controls, the technology was so efficient that you could have a peaceful and quiet universe in the Chinese internet. And suddenly, with the death of this doctor in January, it became an explosion of millions and tens of millions of posts on every social media in China that has turned against the government and against the cover-up and against the shame of the management of this crisis in the initial stages. And today we see this situation where the government is putting a bombardment of propaganda to show how good the government is, how good the party is in organizing the defense against the virus, but it hasn't been able yet to win the souls of the Chinese who have been disgusted by what happened initially. And I think it's too early to say what consequences it will have, but I think it's a landmark in Xi Jinping's reign.
A landmark. I'm going to pick up on that point. We have to take a quick break. Stay with us. You're watching The World This Week. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Daily Beast foreign editor Christopher Dickey is with us, as is Vivian Walt, Paris correspondent for Time Magazine, France 24's very own Yenna Lee, and Pierre Aski, columnist for flagship French public radio station France Inter and president of Reporters Without Borders. Just before the break, you were saying how China, in its handling of the corona crisis, in the crisis management, had yet to win over hearts and souls after the initial cover-up there. But at the same time, Beijing seeming to shrug off concerns from abroad this week, what with a 10-year sentence handed down to Hong Kong bookseller Gui Minhai, a Swedish citizen now. He vanished while on vacation in Thailand in 2015, only to reappear in China, where he confessed to crimes, a fatal drunk driving accident. This Friday, we also had three prominent Hong Kong activists, including business tycoon Jimmy Lai, who were arrested for taking part in a demonstration all the way back on August the 31st.
And last week, a lawyer from Guangzhou, Su Zheyong, who's a very famous dissident in China, was arrested. The crackdown and the necessity seen by Xi Jinping to maintain stability, which is the key word in the Chinese establishment, is overwhelming. And there's no way the party and the government will let that.
But why target the Hong Kong bookseller now?
I think the signal is don't try anything while we are fighting the virus, and we look maybe weaker than usual. I think that's the mentality and the logic of the system in China, is that you have to, there's a say in China, you have to kill the chicken to frighten the monkeys. You make examples. So you take Mr. Gui Minhui and that is a warning to everybody else. And that's the way things are being done in China, whether there's an epidemic or not.
All right, we're going to turn our attention now to the Middle East and what could be a domino effect for Europe. Some wondering if it could be 2015 all over again. The first refugees arriving in the Greek island of Lesbos by dinghy and by land to the Bulgarian border, where they found themselves trapped in a no man's land after Turkey said, in anticipation of a mass influx from Syria's Idlib province at its southern border, that it could no longer hold migrants.
I heard the news, and that's why I came. I want to go to Europe.
How long have you been traveling for?
2.5 hours.
We've been living in Istanbul. We want to go to Edirne and from there to Greece.
Vivian Walt.
Well, what's amazing, firstly, these folks probably don't do their asylum cases much good by what they say. I mean, the EU is not particularly sympathetic with to have, untold numbers of people who are using this moment to move into the EU. But what's also striking is it's been 5 years since the migrant crisis, and the EU still does not have a continent-wide system in place, and really they've failed to get a kind of consensus agreement about what to do about the migrant crisis.
Well, they pay Turkey.
Right, exactly. But that apparently is no longer going to work. So it does seem like it's going to be a replay of what we went through.
It's going to be a replay, Chris Riddick?
Well, it could be, except it could be a lot worse. I mean, when we were looking at 2015, we were looking at the way this might inspire far-right movements, crypto-fascists, neo-Nazis. Well, now we know it did, and it gave them a huge boost. If there is a threat of a new influx that's even remotely on the scale of what we saw in 2015, it is really going to upset the entire political dynamic in Europe. I mean, I think that's not a hard prediction to make.
I would take it a step before, because we're witnessing something very cynical, the way Turkey is handling the whole business. Why is Turkey suddenly telling the migrants to rush to Greece? Because it wants the Europeans to back it in its confrontation in Syria.
And we've seen a statement from the French president today.
Absolutely, and they went to NATO and they got a statement again, nothing more than a statement. But I think it's a political game, and I don't think we'll have the 2 million migrants.
It's a political game with millions of pawns out of Syria.
But first of all, we have to think of that cynicism, which is using millions of people.
Yeah, I'm no big fan of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and I think he is a cynical. Cynical person. But the Europeans are every bit as cynical as he is. They are leaving Turkey to deal with this whole thing. In fact, that kind of cynicism is also reflected within Europe. Why is a fascist like Salvini so powerful in Italy? Because Europe said, Italy, you keep all those refugees from North Africa. You keep all those refugees there. Look at the chaos that you see in Lesbos now. You're going to see a lot worse in Greece, because Europe says, Greece, you keep them. So it's always you keep them. And France loves to preach to the rest of Europe about this, but France isn't taking them.
But Vivian was saying there's no consensus. Indeed, we know that the 27 cannot agree on an immigration policy and on asylum policy. This is a fact. We have a great dividing line in Europe, and even those who preach an agreement
But Turkey has taken in millions of Syrian refugees. It didn't just dump them all in Europe. It has millions of Syrian refugees. Yes. And its sort of cobbled together idea in Idlib province was that you would create a kind of a zone, even if it's a no man's land, it would be the refugees' land, and they could put people there. Well, that's all fallen apart. That's all disintegrating now. That's exactly what we're seeing. So who's going to solve this problem? Who's going to address it?
No one is going to address it, because we are in a situation where we are bordering chaos between the regional powers who are trying to get the upper hand, between Russia, Iran, Turkey, and the big powers are outside this game. The US are washing their hands because they think the Atlantic is big enough to contain the migrants in Europe. And so nobody is going to solve this problem. And we have this growing crisis. And maybe it's a false alert in the sense that Turkey will not do what it says. But there's no solution at the moment. There's no solution.
Yana Lee, you agree?
Well, I think everybody knew that this would be a recurring problem, because we knew this wasn't a solved issue when Brussels and Ankara signed that deal. It was a temporary, Turkey can handle it for now, kind of until the war peters out. Let's see what happens next. Temporary solution that obviously did nothing but put, as you said, human beings, Syrians, pawns in this much larger conflict. And there's now 1 million of them, I think, who have been displaced since December the 1st in northwest Syria. It's just ongoing, and none of the governments, whether the European or the Turkish government, have really thought about Syrians, because I guess it's not in their interest.
And just not much coverage for the fact that schools are being bombed in Idlib province.
Yeah, a lot of kids are freezing as well.
People get used to atrocities. If there are enough atrocities, people just change the channel.
Turkey retaliating for the airstrike that killed 33 of its soldiers late Thursday. Ankara claiming to have hit 200 Syrian government targets inside of Idlib province and killed 20 troops. And there you see where we're talking about here, that border between Turkey and Syria. Meanwhile, 2 Russian Navy frigates equipped with Caliber cruise missiles sailing through Istanbul's Bosphorus this Friday as they made their way towards the Syrian coast. Of course, Vivian Walt, it's the normal agreement between Turkey, which allows Russia to send its troops and its vessels through the Bosphorus to the Mediterranean. And they were on the phone, Erdogan and Putin. It's so confusing, because are they rivals or are they working together?
Well, it's totally confusing, and on top of it, we haven't begun to focus on the fact that basically Assad is winning and
Has won.
And what does this actually mean for the entire region? As you say, here you have Russia right into the heart of NATO territory, and what about the 9 million Syrian refugees? How do you ever piece this country back together again? It's really difficult to begin to imagine it. And the great implications are that, you have Russia really having pulled off quite a victory in the region.
Yeah.
There was an attempt, I think, by Erdogan to have a kind of condominium with Russia. He's a member of NATO, but he's bought this missile system S-400 from the Russians, which has created a lot of trouble with the Americans. And he's trying to pull the same thing in Libya, where he's on the other side with the Russians. So you have a similar situation in both Syria and Libya, where Turkey and Russia are on two sides, but are trying to solve the problems, except that it didn't work in Idlib. And all of a sudden you have this major crisis. And I think that's Erdogan's failure to be the kingmaker of the Middle East that we are seeing now.
All right. The other big story that we've been following for you this week, it's under riot police protection that Muslims in a neighborhood of India's capital staged Friday prayers on the roof of a mosque that was partially burned after a week that's seen Delhi's worst sectarian rampages since the assassination of Indira Gandhi in 1984. 42 killed so far, hundreds injured, as clashes to protest the Hindu nationalist government's new citizenship law turned ugly, with Vivian Walt, police accused of standing idle.
Yeah, turning a blind eye. This is not Gujarat. It's the capital of the most populous country in the world, and it's very it's extraordinary. And what's most extraordinary is that it really happened completely at the same time as Trump's visit to Modi, which made the whole thing appear to be a kind of like, nationalism triumphs while there was violence on the street.
Yeah, let's listen to Donald Trump. Donald Trump, who would not be drawn on that citizenship amendment bill, but he did defend India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi.
We did talk about religious freedom, and I will say that the Prime Minister was incredible on what he told me. He wants people to have religious freedom, and very strongly. And he said that in India they have worked very hard to have great and open religious freedom.
How much does where does that leave the United States, a statement like that?
I mean, President Trump is not a stupid man. And, it's not like he wasn't aware of what was going on or what has been going on actually for months now in India. But, there are enormous business concerns at stake here and a kind of, I think, a real kind of affinity between the two men.
Is it affinity? What was this about, this visit for you, Christopher Dickey? Because he
Trade, money, usual things with Trump.
because we had that Howdy Modi rally back in September in Texas where
Sure.
Trump welcomed Modi. This time he went to Ahmedabad.
Sure, and also India to some extent is seen as a counterbalance to China. I mean, there's all kinds of geopolitical and economic reasons to have this kind of accommodation. But Trump, as usual, always takes it one step further. He doesn't need to endorse Modi's view of religious freedom. If he knew anything about Modi as governor of Gujarat or as prime minister of India, he would know that isn't the case. Maybe he does. Maybe he's smart enough to know that. But since we were talking about cynics earlier, who could be more cynical than Donald Trump?
I was shocked by that sentence that you just played because I think he's overplaying it. He didn't need to go that far in covering Modi because, as Vivian said, it's been going on for months, so he knows everything about how sensitive this issue is. But you have the meeting of two nationalists. You have the meeting of the US who's trying to counter China, and India is a good partner to counter China. You have the developments in Afghanistan, which are taking place at the moment. The signing with the Taliban is scheduled tomorrow. So you have this disengagement and a very tricky operation that's going to take place there. So there are many reasons for the US to have good relations with India, but why overplaying it and covering what is ultra-nationalism at work in India? I don't understand.
It's only words, it's only lies. I mean, why would Trump care about that? He really doesn't.
Yenna Lee?
Donald Trump, I mean, since he's been at the helm of Washington, the United States, honestly, like the US has lost a lot, if not all of its moral authority when it comes to anything diplomatic. Obviously, he's there for business. Obviously, he's there for money. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think France does a lot of business with India as well, but we can't rely on him to say anything about anything horrific happening in regards to human rights in India. And just a word on Narendra Modi. It's horrible. It's a horrible thing to say, but how can we be surprised by what's been happening last week when we knew what kind of man he was? He's the head of the BJP, when he was chief minister of Gujarat, when he has associations to the RSS, which is an extreme right group. This is horrific, but none of it was that surprising.
Also, I mean, we have to filter everything President Trump does at this point through the prism of the fact that he is in campaign mode and that he is in the middle of for him, the election has already begun.
It's about domestic reasons. Let's talk about that campaign right now. For months, we've all been wondering who of the Democrats' crowded field of candidates will get the right to challenge Trump in November. The pace is about to quicken, with the primary in South Carolina on Saturday, followed 3 days later by Super Tuesday. For the one-time frontrunner, well, it's suddenly do or die.
I promise you this. If you send me out of South Carolina with a victory, there will be no stopping us. We'll win the nomination, we'll win the presidency, and most importantly, we'll eliminate the fear so many have in this country of a second term of Donald Trump.
Christopher Dickey?
Maybe. I mean, Biden's doing very well in the polls in South Carolina, largely because he has a lot of support from the black community there, which is a good thing. A lot of Democrats are concerned about the possibility that the momentum built up by Bernie Sanders in the earlier primaries will take him through to the nomination or to a very badly divided convention. I think that there will be, in fact, a desire, more than a desire, on the part of virtually all the Democrats, maybe even including Bernie, to unify at some point before the convention. I think they understand that they have to take responsibility collectively as well as individually for getting rid of Donald Trump. And they can't do that if they're all fighting with each other. But there is a problem with a certain element among Bernie's supporters, that they are hugely vindictive and passionate in the worst kind of way. And a lot of them, as we saw in the last election, a lot of them would rather do anything than vote for somebody besides Bernie Sanders. That's not a good thing. It's not something actually that we see with any of the other candidates.
All right. This week, Chris Radicki talking about the importance of the Democrats pulling together. This week's debate in Charleston was a bit of an unruly affair. There was lots of shouting, lots of interrupting, and the frontrunner pushed on whether Russia is secretly helping him.
And let me tell Mr. Putin, who interfered in the 2016 election, try to bring Americans against Americans. Hey, Mr. Putin, if I'm president of the United States, trust me, you're not going to interfere in any more American elections.
Vivian Wald?
There's something comical about it, but yes, I'm not sure, how he thinks he's going to, stop any interference from Russia, but obviously, he needs to portray himself as being seriously anti-Russian, anti-Putin, for the very fact that one of his great weaknesses was his fondness in previous years for the Soviet Union. And, that among many Democratic voters is something that could certainly harm him. He has to come out being vociferously anti-Russian at this point.
So does it hurt or help him when at that debate, Pieraski, he defends Cuba's track record when it comes to literacy and healthcare?
Well, it's a tricky issue because on healthcare, that's his basic program, and if he can, he's using Cuba as a strange example of a successful healthcare policy, which I'm more skeptical about. But still, I don't think it helps him in terms of the global voters in the US, but it probably helps him to establish his credentials as a true and real defensor of the poor and the underdogs of the society. So it fits in his present character description without, he's taking the good side of Cuba and not, obviously, the political and repressive side.
Back to Putin and Bernie Sanders. I don't think he's trying to desperately show that he's anti-Putin. I think he generally is anti-Putin. I don't think he's done anything in his track record that would prove otherwise. I think it's very genuine when he criticizes Putin and his attempts to do anything in the U.S. elections.
All right, the South Carolina primary, which takes place Saturday, then it'll be Super Tuesday. We'll be covering it all here on France 24. Chris Radicki, Yenna Lee, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Pieraski, Vivian Walt. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there.
It's France's answer to the Oscars. This year, not going so well.
No, sharp intake of breath. It really has turned into something of a nightmare year for the César. And it's all down to one issue, one person, really. This sign kind of says it all. A lot of feminists planning to protest outside the César ceremony tonight. This is one of the placards that we've seen. Polanski, rapist, and the cinema industry is his partner in crime, basically, they say on this particular placard. One hashtag that we've seen a lot of is Violansky, which is basically Rapansky, if you like, because viol is rape. This is the scene outside La Salle Pleyel. It does appear to be getting a little problematic out there. There have been reports of there being tear gas fired too. There are very, very large crowds of protesters who have gathered because, of course, Roman Polanski's movie J'accuse, or An Officer and a Spy, as it's called in English, has topped the nominations, 12 nominations, and a lot of people very, very upset that all of those potential plaudits could go to someone who's a convicted child rapist. This person, this journalist from Mediapart, is down there. She says it's a shocking contrast, really, between the scenes of the crowds in clouds of tear gas. But on the red carpet, it's kind of business as usual with people taking selfies. However, elsewhere, far from business as usual, Roman Polanski himself has already said that he won't be attending. He said he feared a public lynching. He went on to say that what place can there be in such deplorable conditions for a film about the defence of truth, the fight for justice, blind hate and anti-Semitism. I think he's seeing himself as a victim of blind hate these days. Not everyone agrees with that. Interestingly, though, the entire cast and crew of J'accuse have now said they are boycotting the ceremony, including the star, Jean Dujardin, who you may remember from The Artist, the silent movie that did so well. He is not going to be there, and neither are any of those involved. He's clearly quite bitter about it. He's posted on Instagram and he has said here, I would just like to remind you that J'accuse, I accuse is the title of a rather famous article by Émile Zola. I hope that this doesn't bother anyone. So that's his message. He's clearly not happy about the public backlash to this movie and to Roman Polanski's continued popularity among those within the industry. This person, though, has a very interesting take on this.
And the movie did well at the box office, by the way.
Absolutely, yes. And it's a tricky one, isn't it? Where do we draw that divide between art and somebody's wrongdoing in their personal life? I know where I stand on it, but a lot of people don't feel the same way. This tweet, though, it does make an interesting point. She says she finds it unfortunate, really, regrettable, that everyone is going to be penalised because of this controversy. Polanski is not nominated 12 times. Hundreds of artists worked on this movie. And of course, this would have been their big moment, but none of them are actually going to be at the awards ceremony tonight. France's culture minister has taken an interesting, rather mixed stance on this one. He has said that it would be a bad look for France to give the award of Best Director to Roman Polanski, but he has said that he would be quite okay with it getting the Best Film award.
Right.
Which is a little bit of a hedging his bets, I think, there.
Okay.
Another person who's not going to be there tonight is Brad Pitt. He was supposed to be getting the honorary award. He originally said he would be there, then he decided that he wouldn't. Now, he's not stated his reasons, but a lot of people speculating, is it about this controversy over Roman Polanski, and maybe he just doesn't want to be involved with the César this year.
And there's one newspaper headline that's been drawing a backlash.
Yes, the front page of Libération has caused quite a stir online today. The big divide, they call it, and that is Roman Polanski on the left. On the right is a French actress named Adèle Haenel. You may not have heard of her. She's not as well known internationally, but she is one of the nominated actresses tonight for Best Actress in Portrait of a Lady on Fire. Now, they've called it the big divide. They've also talked about the settling of scores, interestingly, in that little subheading there. A lot of people very angry. This person saying that you've got to delete that front page. Polanski should never be on a front page of a paper unless it's a photo of him behind bars. So Adèle Haenel herself says that she was abused by a movie director when she was a child, and she has said that by honouring Polanski, or potentially honouring Polanski, you are insulting all rape victims.
So this is a story that's going to continue. Many thanks for that, Emma James. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in The World This Week.